Welcome to our 8th and final session on Martin Luther. Luther's life was full of incredible moments, from being struck by lightning and becoming a monk, to discovering God's righteousness was a free gift, to the 95 Theses against the sale of indulgences that he posted on the cathedral door in Wittenberg. Luther's life was full of incredible moments. In this final session, we'll see how Luther's teachings led to one final important gathering, this time in Augsburg, where Luther and his followers would see that reforming the existing church would no longer be possible. A new church body, which would come to be known as the Lutheran Church, was born.
Mahatma Gandhi, the pacifist who helped India gain independence from Great Britain, once said, "Those who believe religion and politics aren't connected don't understand either." Even though this statement was made 400 years after Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, the statement was painfully applicable to Martin Luther. While Luther understood the teachings of the Bible, he had little understanding on how to navigate the politics of the church or the politics of government. Because of his teachings and influence, Martin Luther was forced to deal with the politics of Germany. He was also forced to deal with the politics of Rome and the Catholic Church. For Martin Luther, the mixing of religion and politics seemed irreconcilable. Luther was at odds with the Catholic Church because of their religious practices. And in Wittenberg, Germany, Elector Frederick had died and his son John took over. Luther was at odds with John the Elector because of his desire to form alliances to protect the religious freedoms. This put Luther in a difficult position because John the Elector was protecting Luther from arrest and prosecution by Rome and the Catholic Church. By 1529, Luther remained very popular and influential in Germany and throughout Europe. John the Elector had requested Luther's endorsement to allow alliances between Germany and other European countries. The alliances were to protect Germany and other European provinces from Rome and allow them to practice religion as taught by Martin Luther. There was a real fear that the Holy Roman Empire would use armed conflict to put down the opposition to the Catholic Church, brought about by the teachings of Martin Luther in 1529. That fear was realized. A German delegation known as the Nuremberg delegation was sent to Nuremberg to meet with Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to discuss aid to oppose the advancing armies of the Ottoman Empire. The emperor placed the delegation under house arrest. Despite the urgings of the protector, John the Elector, Luther objected to such alliances. First of all, Luther believed that the formation of alliances would lead to armament and then armed conflict. Based upon the teachings of the gospel, Luther believed passive resistance was the proper way to oppose the Catholic Church. John the Elector, on the other hand, was not a believer in passive resistance. He believed that force was permitted to protect German rights, and he did not believe the emperor had authority over the German people.
Elector John sent me to discuss with you the German alliances with other countries in Europe.
You know that the gospel does not support these alliances that are being proposed with the other provinces. Romans 13 teaches us that we are to be loyal to the authorities, including the Holy Roman Emperor.
Luther, I know what you're saying, but these alliances are actually good for us. Our German law clearly states that the Holy Roman Emperor does not have any authority over the princes of Germany.
Yes, but German law is not God's law. What would God have us do?
We should definitely follow God's law. And maybe the Bible says we should follow the emperor or whomever the political party is. But what if the political authority won't allow us to follow God the way we understand or the way you've been teaching? What if the emperor would even use force to make us follow the Pope and the teachings of the church in which we're trying to reform?
We should definitely defend the truth of the gospel. And we should even stand up to the use of force by the emperor. But forming alliances will certainly lead to armed conflict, don't you think?
Well, there is a risk of that. But the Elector John believes that we can create enough alliances to stand up to the emperor. These alliances are actually going to protect you and your teachings. There is an important saying, one may resist force with force.
But if we take up arms, then we would be taking the place of the emperor. It would result in civil war, all against all. The whole continent would be fighting with each other.
This religious and political divide between Rome and Germany existed since the posting of the 95 Theses in 1517. However, in 1529, Charles V realized it was a divide that Rome and the remainder of Europe could no longer afford. The advancing armies of the Ottoman Empire were moving across Eastern Europe and were claiming victories. Charles V wanted to resolve this divide between the churches, and he wanted to resolve the divide between the countries. As a first step, Charles V requested the German princes to compose their confessions of faith and present it to him. The presentation was arranged to take place in Augsburg. John the Elector asked Luther to prepare these confessions of faith. Luther assembled a small team from Wittenberg University, including his good friend Philip Melanchthon, to write this definitive confession of faith. The hope at this point was that Charles V, as Holy Roman Emperor, he was truly making an effort to resolve the differences within the church. And furthermore, the reconciliation between the church in Rome and the church in Wittenberg would lead to a political alliance between Germany and Rome. With an alliance in place, additional resources would be available to fend off the armies from the Ottoman Empire. In March of 1530, Luther and his colleagues presented John the Elector with their confessions of faith. In April, Luther, Melanchthon, and their team joined John the Elector on their journey to Augsburg. Their first stop was in Coburg, the southernmost castle of John the Elector. Unfortunately for Martin Luther, it was the last stop in the journey. He was required to remain in Coburg because he continued to be under the threat of arrest and prosecution after the Diet of Worms. Once again, Luther was isolated and could only communicate with his colleagues by letter. His stay at Coburg was not unlike his isolation in Wartburg. He continued to write books on the Old Testament and sent a steady stream of letters to his colleagues, wanting to know what's happening in Augsburg. Only to add to his misery, while isolated in Coburg, he received the news of his father's death. Upon learning the news, it was said that he sobbed so deeply that he had a headache the whole next day. Martin Luther became more and more agitated with his isolation and separation from his colleagues in the proceedings in Augsburg. He had written an article called "To the Clergy Assembled at Augsburg," which was described as one of his most potent assaults on the Church of Rome. He warned the bishops and the ecclesiastical figures assembled in Augsburg to discuss matters judiciously. He warned them that there was enough popular unrest to cause a revolt worse than the peasant wars. The peasant wars were an earlier uprising of peasants in western and southern Germany who demanded certain rights and freedoms from the nobles and landlords in Germany. That uprising was sparked by Luther's posting of the 95 Theses. Around the end of May, Luther received a draft of the confessions to be presented in Augsburg. These confessions of faith were in fact drafted by Philip Melanchthon, a close associate of Martin Luther. Upon reading the draft, Luther wrote, "It pleases me very much, and I do not know how I could improve on or alter it, for I cannot tread so softly and lightly." He approved of the content and at the same time admitted that he was unable to act in a politically correct way. The confessions of faith were presented to Emperor Charles V on June 25, 1530. The protesting princes read the confessions in German and in Latin. Then the Protestants declared that they would stand by it to the very end. These confessions became known as the Augsburg Confession. There were two parts to the Augsburg Confession. The first part outlined the beliefs and practices that were the same between the Wittenberg Church and the Church in Rome. The second part outlined the abuses of the Church in Rome. On July 12, 1530, after the Augsburg Confession was presented to the emperor, Johann Eck, an ally of the Pope and Luther's old nemesis, presented his arguments against the Augsburg Confession. He presented what was known as the Confutation of the Augsburg Confession, or proof that the Augsburg Confession was wrong. In the fall of 1530, after hearing the arguments by Johann Eck, Charles V demanded that all the assembled politicians and theologians submit to the confutation presented by Johann Eck. Unfortunately, the lines were drawn and no agreement between the churches would be achieved. Martin Luther and his followers would not compromise their beliefs, and the church in Rome and their followers would not compromise their beliefs. As a result of the impasse, Martin Luther softened his stance on alliances. The European provinces formed alliances to fend off any possible retaliation by Rome. Even though it was never the goal of Martin Luther and his followers, they had no choice but to form a new church and implement the practices Luther had learned to be true from his studies of the gospel. The new church would become known as the Lutheran Church. The foundation of the church was the Augsburg Confession.
Philip, the Augsburg Confession was perfect. You took everything we believe and you related it to the Bible. I'm not surprised so many people have adopted it.
Well, thank you, Luther. It was my pleasure to do that. Unfortunately, it didn't change anything for the church in Rome. And if there would have been a little bit more professionalism and you would have treated Bishop Eck a little bit differently, he may have been more receptive.
You may be right, but he deserved a lot worse than what he got from me.
Even so, your teachings have changed everything. People can see now that if they accept the free gift from God, their salvation, and they just have to trust in their faith in Jesus.
I love the way you say that with such confidence, and I am so glad to have been alive to see how many people have received this message.
And it is so exciting that so many people are excited about this.
Yeah.
I have an idea.
Okay.
We will start a new church, and we will name it the Lutheran Church.
The Lutheran Church, that's ridiculous. That'll never catch on.
I bet in 2025 they will still be called the Lutheran Church. You doomcall.
We now invite you to gather in your small groups and discuss the dramatic change that occurred after the rejection of the Augsburg Confession. Consider the overwhelming responsibility of starting a new church at this time and the strength it must have taken for Luther and for so many faithful people to build a church that has endured since 1530. Thank you for joining us for this study, and enjoy your time together today.